Hello, everyone. Welcome to lecture number 2. Today, we're going to look at two interrelated topics. First, we're going to look at the difference between prescriptive and descriptive accounts of language. Account, maybe not the correct term there, but rules about language, focusing primarily on these sort of syntactic rules. And then we're going to transition into a discussion of category, utilizing the discussion that we had prior to that. So focused on what we learned from the difference between prescriptive and descriptive. I do want to mention a little bit about my digital background. I know if you are familiar with the last series, I was not using digital backgrounds. I'm in a different space here, which isn't as conducive to using my real background. Basically a storage space, and so it's a lot messier behind me. So I'm going to have to stick with the digital background, maybe. We'll see how it works when I start trying to use the whiteboard, the chalkboard, things like that. Often when you hold up items, the digital background doesn't work as efficiently, though I can play with green screen and things like that. I do have a pretty janky green screen to work with. But I want to start off by talking about this difference between the prescriptive rules of language and descriptive rules of language. And so our primary focus in this class is going to be on descriptive accounts of language. But I don't think we can ignore prescriptive rules for a number of reasons. First, I think most of us are most familiar with sort of prescriptive rules of language. That is, we're taught versions of these prescriptive rules throughout our education. So that when we take English classes, when we take, and here's the cats, when we take, our classes about composition, things like that, the typical things that we are taught are versions of prescriptive rules. Now, there's some variation on this. If we're a second language learner, then we are going to also be learning some of our descriptive rules. But in general, we're not learning our rules of our descriptive rules of language. We may a little bit in our, say, high school composition classes or college composition classes as L1 speakers of a language, because that's not necessary. We already know these rules. So instead, they're teaching us rules of stylistic convention, which is fundamentally what prescriptive rules are. Now, but prescriptive rules have a sort of other layer to them, depending on the nature of the rule. Because these prescriptive rules, some of them take on a rule of being sort of in a wider sphere of being a quote-unquote actual rule of the language. Even though they're really fundamentally a rule of style. They're a conventionalized rule of style. They're a rule of preference. They're not something that we know inherently. So I want to focus on a couple of these really quickly, but we can talk about, you're going to see a number of these, and we'll touch on more of these throughout the course. But you'll be exposed to these throughout your day-to-day life, in basically every composition class, every writing class you ever take. And again, they're not necessarily bad in context. Different writing for different genres, writing for different modalities, they're going to have different types of styles, different types of expectations, and we should be aware of those styles and expectations. So knowing the rules of those styles and those expectations is perfectly fine. Where they become problematic is in the wider sphere as they're used to try to determine people's intelligence in places where this style is not warranted, such as a normal conversation, or writing on a Facebook post, something like that, or as sort of a declarative about the way the language should look. And that's often how they're used. So I want to again focus on a couple of these. So I want to start with a sort of one of the most contemporaneous ones, which deals with the use of pronominals, pronouns. And we can sort of trace back the history of these. And I want to start. So the question deals with the use of they in a singular context. And there's two different pieces that we can sort of break out of this. So there's the use of they in a singular context where the referent, where the person that we're referring to, is unknown, and they in a singular context where the referent is known. And there's a lot of great linguistic work that's coming out right now, sort of delving into this topic in some great detail. I really encourage you to look at some of this. Kirby Conrad has some really great work on this, and a few other linguists are doing some really great work on this. But so these two uses are quite interesting. The use of they when the referent is known is perhaps slightly more novel for some speakers. But the use of they when the reference is unknown is, and even, I want to backtrack a little bit, even the use of they when the reference is known is actually not that novel for most speakers. But some speakers claim that it really is. But the use of they when the referent is unknown. So this is something along the lines of each student must bring their book to class. This actually is a very, very old use of they. So what makes this singular is that each student, that's a singular noun, and then we have this they, which supposedly is this plural pronoun. Ow! Stop biting me. So that's that's the context here, and the development of the quote unquote rules surrounding this are quite interesting. So if we look back in, like, let's say the 19th century, the construction would have been exactly like each student must bring their book to class. That's what this sentence would have looked like, and this would have been uncontroversial. Starting about 100 years ago, so this is going into the 1920s, style guides started to say, hey, that's a little old-fashioned. That sounds a little funky. That sounds a little old-fashioned. And, that's really a singular expression. So let's make this he. And this caught on in the style guides, and this is what was taught. So it switched from each student must bring their book to class to each student must bring his book to class. This, of course, later evolved thanks to the note that, the students aren't all male. This notion of the default male is problematic, which notice that in the older expression that wasn't a problem. We were sort of just aligning out the sort of gender assumptions. When we started introducing this in the style guides, we introduced this and we were like, well, but it's not really a man. It's just the default. Then, so we started using he or she in our style guides. which of course gets very clunky. And But that was to avoid this quote unquote problematic they. And now we're sort of circling back to the use of they, because it avoids the sort of very clunky expression he or she or he slash she. And also now we recognize that there are more genders. And so they is more inclusive. And so there's more reasons why we're doing this. And then they is also being used in in additional contexts. Though it was probably also used in these other contexts. I mean, the records of these are whether or not we can find it with a great deal of when we have these specifics, we don't. This is often used when you know the reference. This is used more conversationally. We do find certainly use of singular they throughout early literature, Shakespeare, all sorts of things. So singular they is sort of the standard, and then we tried to change that using these prescriptive style guides, and we're sort of moving back to the default. And again, in general, things like a prescriptive, oh no, you're supposed to use he. These are things that are added on to a system that already exists. And so when we are working with a linguistic system, when we try to monkey around with it, we try to change it, people are going to make mistakes or ignore it and things like that. So even folks that claim they are opposed to singular they because that's become a political stance, if you look at records of their conversations, you're going to find that they're more likely than not going to use it. More interestingly now, we find folks claiming for political reasons they don't have pronouns, things like that. Of course, pronouns are just part of a linguistic system, and so that's also not really a thing, But again, this is part of, one, a linguistic misunderstanding, and two, part of a sort of a general political stance. But this notion of singular they is again, it's really part of it. I mean, again, the historical record probably isn't as clear with the use of singular they, but it probably was used in a singular context as early as they was borrowed from Old Norse. There's a whole interesting history with they. It was actually borrowed from Old Norse. We don't normally see these types of borrowings in pronouns, but English did this, and we probably get that type of borrowing. Anyway, so that's one thing that's a very hot topic right now, dealing with pronouns. And when we look historically, they has always had a singular use. It really starts in the early 20th century, an attempt to sort of shut that use down, and then more modern usage. This has become more controversial in a modern context, where folks are trying to add even more political context to the use of singular they, because of the folks trying to deny equal gender recognition. So that's where things are. But grammatically, L1 English speakers probably default understand that English they is also useful in a singular context for sort of a default gender. So they is, we talk about this in linguistic, in like sort of more technical linguistic terms. They is probably not specified for gender. It is so it, and that's why it can show up in both in these plural contexts where it shows up in both to represent groups of any gender, and also shows up in these other contexts, including singular. Similar to that, well, so moving a little bit away from some of these political contexts, we see other types of contexts where sort of instruction and like misinformation starts to lead to sort of linguistic misunderstanding. And I think one of the other big places where this occurs is the passive. So the passive is deeply maligned. And we're going to actually, much later in the term, we're going to talk about a linguistic analysis of the passive. We're going to spend a decent amount of time sort of breaking down the passive. But the passive is, and I'm guessing, I'm going to go ahead and guess that everyone in this classroom has had an experience with an instructor, a professor, someone, maybe reading their writing, circling something and saying no passive. And there's a general sense in certain circles that the passive should be prohibited or at least widely avoided. And again, this runs into the same notion of certain styles are, depending on the context, certain styles are to be utilized or not. Now, here's where this really starts to run into some problems. First, many of the people that are doing this don't actually know what the passive is. Or if they do, they only have sort of a vague notion of what the passive is. So we see passives being identified because the verb itself feels sort of passive-like it's a more passive-ish, like the verb has sort of a notion of being passive to it, which it's not. Like the what a passive is where you have a transitive or ditransitive and you demote the subject and you promote the object. That is a passive. Nothing else grammatically is a passive. There are a number of other constructions that may look like passives. They have very similar sorts of structures. So we can have the causative coative construction. So a causative incoative construction is something like the John broke the window. That's a causative construction because John caused the window to break is essentially what that means. The incoative version is the window broke. And one of the ways we can tell that that's not a passive is it lacks any of the sort of morphology or syntactic pieces that show us that that's a passive. So we can compare that to a sentence like, Susan was arrested by the police. That's a passive. And the active version of that sentence is the police arrested Susan. So one of the questions we might ask is, well, why do we want to use a passive? Well, often it's because the information that's in the object position is actually the more relevant information. And maybe the agent isn't relevant, and so we're just going to leave it out. It's often taught that we're trying to, avoid mentioning the agent to try to, because it's passive and we're trying to remove responsibility. And certainly that can be the case. And that, is a good reason perhaps to avoid the use of the passive in certain contexts. So, like, you actually see this a lot in police shootings, where the passive is used instead of an active. And that a lot of media criticism does focus on the use of the passive in that very context. And that might be a legitimate criticism. But imagine a sentence like, the president was arrested by the FBI. This sentence is probably, this is a passive, but it is probably a very good passive, because the most interesting information in that sentence is the fact that the president, that's the most important piece of information, that the president was arrested. It is important that the FBI did the arresting, but it's not the most important information. We're mostly interested in the fact that it was the president. This is big news. So that would be a use of a passive that would, I don't think anyone would be like, we're trying to avoid responsibility. No, we're focusing on the primary information. We also see this a lot in the use of scientific papers. And this is an area where, again, there's probably a grain of truth to some of these, the sort of prescriptive rule that then gets exploded. So if you're reading like a scientific paper that is walking through an experimental design, well, frequently that's going to be written in a passive construction, because it's sort of taken as a given that the experimenter was the one doing this thing. So the solution was boiled the solution was raised to 145 degrees. That is a perfectly reasonable description of what is happening in this experiment. You don't need to know the experimenter raised the solution to 145 degrees. In fact, that obscures the relevant information if you're trying to understand what was happening in the experiment. So there, again, the passive is maligned. Our cat is back. So I want to also talk now about instances where, as I mentioned, the passive is misunderstood. And it's not just the case that the passive is maligned, because it can be very useful. It can be, it also is misidentified. So I mentioned that it can be the causative and codative. A middle is another example where you might find people misidentifying a passive. And maybe, again, maybe stylistically, you don't, these are close enough for our purposes. Sure. But that's a different case. That's still not our, that's still not what we want to, that's still not something like, it's still not helpful to say, don't use this, don't use the passive, when we can't properly identify the passive. And it's been noted before by linguists that some of the key style guides, one of the most famous ones being Strunk and White, misidentify the passive. In fact, more often than they correctly identify it. And I don't remember the exact examples. I do have a couple copies of Strunk and White, much to my chagrin, but I actually couldn't find them this morning. But I do remember them close enough. It's sentences like, there were many leaves on the ground is identified as a passive, and then a corrective sentence is placed. Well, that's not a passive. That is what's referred to as a their associate sentence or a their expletive sentence. And again, there might be reasons stylistically why you wouldn't want to use that, but it's not a passive. Actually, I did pull up this in a paper. Um, the reason that he left college was that his health had become impaired. Or his health became impaired. It doesn't really matter. It's still not these are not passive constructions. These might be sentences that are clunky. These might be sentences that have issues stylistically, but the issue is not the use of the passive. So, what do we have to say about this? Well, again, it comes down to a fact of, well, one of the things we want to do is when we're studying syntax, being able to properly identify the type of grammatical construction is going to be critical for us. And this is going to help us not only if we are wanting to do linguistic analysis, but also if we have other types of interests, like, say, in teaching how to teach composition or teach an L2 language and so forth. Because we can avoid these pitfalls of telling people the wrong information, which ultimately leads to more confusion. I want to provide just a few more examples of this, and then sort of kind of close out with a summary of this distinction between prescriptive and descriptive. And these ones will be a little bit quicker. So a few other sort of famous examples of descriptive versus prescriptive rules or of famous prescriptive rules. So another really famous one is this notion that we shouldn't split our infinitives. So an infinitive in English is the to plus an uninflected verb form. So to shop, to go, to buy. And so the argument, the prescriptive rule says don't put any sort of modifier, anything in between to and that infinitive. Really interesting origin to this rule here. There was a period where Latin was our sort of main language of learning, language of science, and so forth. And folks were wanting English to be more like Latin. Like Latin is the language. Well, in Latin, you don't split your infinitives. And there's a very good reason why you don't split your infinitives in Latin. Infinitives in Latin are a single word. In English, they're two words. So much easier to split because, there's words. So someone wrote a style guide, said, hey, we're going to be more like Latin. They didn't say it in exactly those words, but we're going to be more like Latin. We're not going to split our infinitives. And that really caught on. So, of course, we get, the Star Trek motto, to boldly go, which is a split infinitive, and people say, ungrammatical. It's perfectly grammatical. And you can find cases where it really becomes odious or really difficult to understand what's being said without that split infinitive. Again, this is a stylistic preference. There's nothing wrong with splitting an infinitive. There might be times where it is communicatively more important to split it and communicatively less important to split it. For our purposes, we're going to look at split infinitives as why can we do this? What does it mean? What does it tell us? And actually, it's going to tell us some pretty interesting things in English. So keep that in mind. There is another really famous example of never end a sentence with a preposition. This is, again, one that follows from Latin. And it's generally a property of the Romance languages that sentences don't end in prepositions. And it's generally a property of Germanic languages that they can. English is a Germanic language, and we have properties that allow us to enter sentences and prepositions, particularly but not exclusively our verb particles. We can also strand our prepositions when we move things. And there's a really famous quote attributed to Winston Churchill. I'm not sure if it's actually was said by him. "This is something up with which I shall not put," showing just how absurd that rule really is, because it violates fundamentally our descriptive rules of the language to try to follow this. And so we will encounter occasionally when these really do butt into each other. Sort of related to that is the this goes back somewhat to our discussion of pronouns, though it's a different area. But I think this is one that pretty much, if I don't want to say speak for folks outside of the U.S., but in the U.S., if you are an L1 speaker of English, you are taught if you are using the first person singular pronoun in a conjunction in the subject position, you're always supposed to put it second, and it's always supposed to be I. So Mary and I went to the store. That is a rule that is drilled into us. So most speakers will naturally say something like, "Me and Mary went to the store," or "Mary and me went to the store." And in fact, there's evidence that we like to use these "me" inside of conjunctions. But this rule is so heavily drilled into us. And again, this is supposed to be something that is only used in subject position, because this is something of an unnatural rule, many speakers do an over-application of this rule. And any time that the first person pronoun is used in conjunction, I will be used. So Mary and I went to the store. John gave a book to Mary and I. And that is, in the second context, that is not supposed to be, I is not supposed to be used in that context, even according to the prescriptive rule. But because the first is an unnatural rule, there's this sort of, the rewrite operation that we're using just sort of over applies it in many contexts. So those are some prescriptive rules. They can actually, prescriptive rules can tell us some interesting things about the nature of description. For instance, that conjunction pronominal rule that we just looked at can tell us some interesting things about the way people conjoin, the way that they apply these rules and things like that. So I don't want to dismiss prescriptive rules. But I would also be chagrined if I didn't sort of talk a little bit more deeply about prescription more broadly. So one of the issues that really exists with prescriptive rules is that it is a way of reinforcing a form of linguistic power, and that is associated with a form of socioeconomic power. And so we find that the types of rules or the types of language that is viewed as correct and that is viewed as the appropriate way of speaking are associated with the folks that have political or social power. And that incorrect, and I'm using incorrect in quotations here, ways of speaking are associated with the lack of political or socioeconomic power. And we can actually see this, you can actually see this quite robustly in other domains of sort of the way in which language is policed. So you can look at the way in which women's speech is policed. So for instance, the way in which look at vocal fry. So vocal fry is or also known as creaky voice. The way it's when I'm doing it right now, and no one's ever going to judge me for using vocal fry. If you look at Bill Clinton was the master of vocal fry. But women, and you can find countless news articles about how women are the worst for using vocal fry. Countless other ways in which, if you look at the speech of people of color, it's very similar, where though that type of speech is the rules of their language is viewed as problematic, is viewed as incorrect. And at no point in our discussion of syntax, in our analysis of description, are we going to take that view. That's non-scientific. It's not based in any. It's not based in anything. It's based purely in a sort of societal prejudice. So our interest is purely in how do people speak, and why do they speak that way. And of course, in this class, the focus is going to be on what is the sort of underlying syntactic structures. There's also, all of everything I talked about so far is also relates to various forms of sociolinguistics and other types of related topics. So there's lots of other ways to analyze these topics as well. Okay, I want to now quickly move to category, and I'm not going to spend a lot of time on category. We will move and talk a little bit more on category in our next video. But category has a sort of similar issue that the notion of rules do. So category are things like noun, verb, adverb, adjective, preposition. We'll introduce some new categories that I think will, complementizer, determiner. You may have been exposed to that as something called an article, but we'll use some new terminology for that. But these are syntactic categories that are associated with their position in the syntactic tree and their relationship within the constituent structure. And that's really going to be the focus of what we do next time. But much like what we talked about with prescriptive rules, there's a lot of sort of teaching about what category is, particularly these sort of main lexical categories, so like noun and verb. You can go watch some videos by the Schoolhouse Rock about what a noun is, what a verb is. And I'm just going to use some of the sort of standard definitions from these sort of classic terms. So a noun is a person, place, thing, and then often idea is tacked on. A verb is an action or a state of being, things like that. There are some problems with these. There's some big problems with these. So, when we look at this definition of a noun, the person, place, thing, well, those are all kind of concrete things. They all have to be tangible things in the real world, unless you really openly define what it means to be a thing, and then then what it means to be a noun is meaningless. And that's why they that's why they tack idea on. All right, so let's throw idea in there. So then we suddenly have idea in there. So freedom's also in there. Okay, so now we have intangibles as well. Well, let's look at a noun. Let's take the noun assassination. So an assassination it's definitely a noun. How do I know it's a noun? Well, it takes it shows up in all the places that nouns show up. Is it a person? No. Is it a place? No. Is it a thing? I mean, in the broadest sense of what a thing is, but in that sense, everything's a thing. You know, I don't know what a thing is. Is it an idea? Sure, but so is assassinate in that in that case. So this definition really starts to fail for us because assassination is really an action. It's just the noun description of what that action is. That's a problem. These sort of semantic-based definitions that are these sort of classic definitions start to fall apart the moment we really start to look at them. And further than that, when we start to look cross-linguistically, we find that category, this notion of noun, verb, adjective, adverb, well, the way in which things are slotted into their different categories varies quite a bit from language to language. So this type of semantic definition isn't going to work for us when we look at the world's languages. So what are we going to use instead? Well, we're going to introduce a slightly circular definition, and you're just going to have to bear with me. But our definition is basically going to be a noun is the thing that occurs where nouns occur. And how are we going to determine that? Well, we're going to look at its distribution. So a noun occurs next to things like adjectives, next to things like determiners, numerals, things like that. It can occur in subject position, object position. A verb takes adverbs, can introduce an object, things like that. Those are going to be our definitions. We're going to avoid the use of these semantic definitions because they're going to fail for us. Now, we're going to spend a lot more time looking at these distributional definitions next video as we try to develop our theory of constituency. So that's what we have to look forward to. And with that, I think I will say goodbye for today. I want to, again, as always, leave you with a quote as we, in year 2 of this pandemic, deal with what appeared to be perhaps another round of shutdowns around here. So I hope everyone is taking care of themselves, taking care of those around them, and just being safe, healthy, and as happy as you can be. And I have a quote from the Roman philosopher Seneca here. Wherever there is a human being, there is a chance for kindness. And I will see you next time, and I hope you all have a very safe, however long it is.